There are many things you could criticize Obsidian Entertainment for, but their willingness to support their games post-launch is not one of them. 1 year after its initial release, Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire hasn't just received the usual single-player game treatment of a few bug fixes and some tacked-on DLC. Instead, Obsidian have went above and beyond to support this game, with multiple balance updates that have fixed some of its biggest gameplay-related problems, plenty of new quality of life features, several new main story scenes, and even a completely new turn-based mode which makes it feel almost like a new game entirely. Still, despite the amount of polish and band-aids Obsidian have slapped on, some problems remain that are beyond the reach of post-release patches, and some new features come with their own problems. Still, with its final patch 5.0 having now been released, Deadfire is a much improved game from 1 year ago. It's still not exactly the big jump in quality from the first game that some may have hoped it to be, and it isn't the Baldur's Gate 2 to Pillars of Eternity's Baldur's Gate 1, but it does add some good new features and make some needed improvements, which help make up for its lackluster main story and occasional gameplay misstep. With that said, however, some things need to be made clear about the much hyped new turn-based mode. In terms of new features to be added to a game post-release, turn-based mode is indeed very impressive. As a sort of test run to see how turn-based combat would work in a game like Pillars of Eternity, this new mode feels like an interesting experiment that delivers some really promising results. And as a marketable feature that might draw players back to Deadfire, or just get people talking about the game again, turn-based mode seems to have been very successful. But as an actual way to play through the entire game and offer a viable alternative to Deadfire's default real-time with pause combat, turn-based mode has some serious problems. Some people may really hate real-time with pause and not want to play any game that features it, and for these people turn-based mode may be preferable and even offer a way to enjoy a game they otherwise wouldn't have been able to. But the way in which the new game screen offers a choice between classic and turn-based mode, where they're presented as equal and where turn-based mode is recommended for players who simply enjoy turn-based games, seems misleading. Having now played both modes, it's very clear that real-time with pause is the way in which this game is designed to be played, and that turn-based mode is an experimental afterthought. Turn-based introduces a number of problems, and really only players who are strongly against real-time with pause combat should consider using it for their first playthrough. The most notable problem with it is just how slow it is. Even with damage numbers turned up to compensate, fights still take at least 2 to 3 times as long to finish. In a long game with lots of combat, this has a huge impact on pacing. It also means that losing a fight and having to reload can feel very frustrating, as now each fight is a major time investment with no way to rush through. In addition to being slow, turn-based mode also introduces many balance problems that result as a consequence of trying to force the game's rule set to fit into clearly defined turns when it was never designed with this in mind. For example, action speed is an important stat in the real-time with pause mode. In turn-based mode, action speed instead becomes initiative, which is far less valuable. So anything which increased action speed is now worse, and anything that decreased your own action speed is made better. This means heavy armor is greatly buffed. Lots of weapon modals that had speed penalties have had their main drawback removed, many talents, buffs and debuffs are heavily affected, and also the entire dexterity stat is now pretty much worthless. This isn't the only balance change though. Free actions and instant cast spells are better, while hard casting spells that rely on targeting are a bit worse. Weapons that used to require reloading, like guns and crossbows, now reload instantly at the cost of some initiative, making them better, and the same is true for anything else with high recovery time. Meanwhile, buff and debuff durations have been translated from exact durations to lasting a set number of turns, which impacts some things positively and some negatively, and means rounding has a big impact. Increasing a buff's duration by 20% is useful in real time. However, with a new system, if a buff lasts, say, 2 rounds, and you increase its duration by 20%, it still lasts 2 rounds. There are many other balance changes too, and while in theory the turn-based mode could be balanced separately, balancing the base game was already a big task that took months of post-release patches to get it to where it is, and so, unsurprisingly, turn-based balance will be far worse. Outside of balance and combat speed, turn-based mode also has noticeable problems with pathfinding and enemy AI. These aren't unique to turn-based mode, but they have been made more noticeable and sometimes much more impactful. If bad pathfinding causes you to take longer to engage an enemy in real time, it's a small problem, but in turn-based it can cause you to miss an entire standard action, basically forcing you to skip your turn. So overall, turn-based mode has some major issues. That doesn't mean there aren't some benefits to it, however. When everything in combat happens one by one, combat becomes a lot easier to follow. This means players are less likely to feel overwhelmed and can better visualize and process the large amount of information that's involved in a game like this. Pillars of Eternity has always had a bit of a problem with showing an overwhelming amount of things all at once, leading to possible confusion, and turn-based mode just seems better at handling this, and as a result feels a lot better at teaching players the game's rule set in a way they can understand. It feels a little like playing the game with training wheels attached, except really it isn't making the game easier so much as it is making everything clearer. It's an interesting experience. There are too many problems for me to recommend new players to choose this mode, but it's by no means a disaster, and a lot of its problems are simply a direct result from the fact that this game wasn't designed with turn-based combat in mind, and this is very much reflected in its balance and encounter design. If Deadfire was designed from the ground up for this combat system, things could be very different. As it stands, this mode shows a huge amount of potential, and a good turn-based game seems possible with Pillars of Eternity's rule set, it's just not this one. And despite its problems, when considered as a free update, turn-based mode is an impressive addition that works better than it should, although there should perhaps be a warning attached to the mode selection screen telling new players that this mode is a lot slower and this was not how the game was originally designed to be played, and also warning players that this choice can't be changed later, so if they do have second thoughts about which game mode to play, they'll need to start over from scratch with a new character. The generally positive reception to turn-based mode despite its problems must also give Obsidian something important to consider when looking to the future. If there was once a notion that turn-based RPGs are less popular with modern audiences and may not sell well, then, well, Divinity Original Sin and its sequel have pretty much proved that this idea isn't actually true. There is an audience for turn-based RPGs, and by now Obsidian must know this. And with the low sales numbers for Pillars of Eternity 2, that audience might prove important if Obsidian continue to create these kinds of isometric games. Therefore, Obsidian are going to need to think very carefully about exactly what kind of gameplay system they want to make, because the obvious solution, which is to include both and give players the option to choose, is definitely not the easiest solution. Creating two game modes would be far more work to implement, and also mean that design decisions need to work for both modes. Previously simple things like the number of encounters per dungeon become serious challenges. The slower turn-based mode would benefit from less encounters, but if you just removed certain encounters it could have a big impact on XP received, or the crafting item or gold economy, or the map design which might now feel empty. It's not just the question of balancing both modes, which is already a big undertaking, there are all sorts of other issues which need to be considered, and you have to wonder whether it would be better to just pick one mode to focus on and do that as well as possible. But that, of course, would disappoint all the players who prefer the not selected mode. Obsidian have found themselves in a difficult position, but they do have all that Microsoft money now, so maybe they do have the means to really surprise people and do something special. Or maybe they'll have reacted to the huge amount of attention that the Outer Worlds reveal received relative to Deadfire's launch, by abandoning any future isometric projects to instead focus solely on 3D. Who knows? But in light of the excitement around the newly added turn-based mode, it seems a good time to also consider how successful Obsidian have been in their continued attempt to take the real-time with pause gameplay of the classic D&D based Infinity Engine RPGs and modernise and improve upon it with their own system. This seemed to be the goal of the first Pillars of Eternity, and Deadfire has looked to continue down this path with future refinements and changes. This was hard to judge at release due to the game's large problem with the lack of difficulty. At launch, many encounters seemed to be severely undertuned, and the level scaling feature seemed to either not work or do far too little, meaning that after passing the midway point through the game, any semblance of difficulty all but disappeared regardless of chosen settings. Now though, level scaling works perfectly, and encounter difficulty feels exactly where it always should have been. If that's not enough, additional challenge modes and several in-game mega-bosses have been added that seem designed to put even heavily experienced players to the test, and feel almost like an apology from Obsidian for their previous negligence of the more hardcore player base. And so, with its biggest issue well and truly fixed, Pillars of Eternity 2 can be fairly compared to its predecessor to look at the impacts its new changes make. But, as always when the goal is refinement, there is a risk that something can be lost in the process. And unfortunately, Deadfire ended up refining away all elements of resource management that were previously involved with the resting system. In Pillars of Eternity 1, most spells and abilities had a set amount of uses per rest, and resting was limited by requiring camping supplies. In Deadfire, all spell and abilities recharge after each fight, and so does player health. If a character is knocked unconscious in battle, they will receive a minor debuff called an injury, which requires you to rest for it to be removed. However, you're allowed to rest as much as you want, anywhere you want, with no real penalties or costs for doing so. This means the addition of empowerment points, which are poorly designed in general, also don't hold much meaning as they can be replenished so easily by resting. So resource management is effectively no more. Instead of asking players to consider when to save or use their abilities based on the situation, players can instead use almost everything at their disposal in each encounter. And once you're past the very early levels, you're given enough spellcasts and ability uses during an encounter to be able to spam these things near continuously. To not do this means to not play optimally, meaning there is an even greater need to micromanage your party members at all times in Deadfire, despite the fact that Obsidian decided to reduce the number of party members from 6 to 5, specifically to help reduce the amount of micromanagement required. What's more, there's no longer any consequence to each individual fight. Whether you have to use everything at your disposal to barely achieve victory, or whether you end the fight in a single spell, makes no difference at all, because everything recharges as soon as combat ends. Likewise, whether your entire party is brought to near death, or you instead get by without taking a single hit, means nothing, because health just replenishes automatically. This means fights have no meaning beyond whether you win or lose, because how you win or lose is irrelevant. And this change makes fights more repetitive because you can approach every one with the same strategy, without needing to consider whether you need to preserve health or resources for later. The first Pillars of Eternity used a resource and resting system that allowed you to rest too freely to be truly effective, but despite this flaw, the idea behind this system was good. Deadfire instead decides to completely remove this aspect of the game instead of actually trying to fix the problem, and the game is made worse as a result. Another important change is the new armor system. Rather than armor offering a flat damage resistance, Deadfire instead adds a new stat called Penetration, which is then compared to the target's armor rating during each attack to determine how much damage it does. This may sound like a small change on paper, but this system has been designed so that small differences between penetration and armor can lead to big impacts on how much damage is dealt, which makes paying attention to damage type and armor ratings even more important than it was previously. Changing to a different weapon or using the right type of spell is therefore made to be more rewarding, which is good as it helps add to the strategic depth of combat, but this does lead to a few problems. Whereas in Pillars of Eternity 1, accuracy was king, in Deadfire penetration has inherited its throne, but there aren't very many ways to effectively increase your penetration or lower enemy armor. Meaning on higher difficulties, just dealing damage to certain enemies can end up being very time consuming. This can lead to regular situations where fights feel very drawn out, as you can easily out-heal the enemy's damage but just can't raise your own penetration to do much damage in return. Abilities that raise penetration can also feel a bit overpowered, and from a design perspective this new system makes accurate balancing more important by making small differences in stats have such noticeable effects. The changes to armor and penetration are theoretically sound though, just so long as the balancing is well tuned enough to support them. In other ways, Deadfire shows clear evidence of learning from the first Pillars of Eternity's mistakes. Encounter design is more varied. Enemies make greater use of ranged attacks or mobility skills to target your back line, and enemy weaknesses and resistances help encourage the player to pay attention to each foe while also making encounters more distinctive. Still, outside of turn-based mode, the core of its combat is very similar to the first game, for better or worse. It's a shame the changes to the resting system feel like such a downgrade, because otherwise Deadfire's combat would seem generally improved. There is less focus on large dungeons, which can feel a little disappointing, but this has the benefit of improving overall pace. And with the level scaling feature functioning correctly, the much more open-ended design of the world feels vastly superior to how it was before. The first game's static world map functioned really as just a list of locations which players travelled through in a mostly linear fashion. By contrast, Deadfire's overworld lets you traverse freely on foot or by ship, allowing you the freedom to explore the archipelago yourself. This makes the game's world feel a lot more interesting. There's a better sense of scale to the locations you visit. The passage of distance and time feel more noticeable, and it makes the world and your journey feel more immersive. Overall, this form of world map is just much more engaging than the previous system, which was something inherited from Baldur's Gate, and it's great to see an example of Obsidian trying to innovate and managing to do so in a way which feels like a universal improvement, rather than taking one step forward and one step back. The resources, items, and events you encounter on the world map aren't always very impactful, but the more dungeon-like locations offer an enjoyable form of side content that come with good item rewards. And there are at least a few genuinely exciting places to discover. As for those item rewards, it should also be noted that itemization has also been improved, with more varied item effects with unique item upgrades, rather than the generic upgrade system of the first game that made all items feel very similar. But when it comes to good changes, the best has to be the addition of multi-classes and subclasses. Pillars of Eternity's character building was already one of its strengths. While it didn't do a lot to set itself apart from Dungeons & Dragons, it still managed to include a large range of choice in character creation, with a fleshed out talent and spell system and an overall good amount of depth. Now that there's the option to multi-class as well as lots of subclasses, the amount of options available is greatly multiplied. This means individual builds feel more unique, and your character's chosen build offers a much greater sense of identity. There are also lots of opportunities for experimentation and synergies. In short, it's great, and for how many more options this opens up, it's also surprisingly well balanced. The drawback of missing out on the highest level abilities and talents in order to gain access to a whole other talent tree feels fair, both in terms of combat strength, but also in terms of how fun the class is to play. It means both single and multi-class options have their own strengths and reward for picking them. And while some balance discrepancies can be very noticeable, such as caster/caster multiclasses being fairly pointless, or certain subclasses being much stronger than others, overall anything lost in balance is more than made up for by what these additions add. Not every new addition is so successful though, and even post-release support hasn't been enough to salvage Deadfire's other shiny new feature, which is the player's ship. Giving the player their own ship fits well with the setting, and collecting crew members as you journey around can even be quite fun, but the details of ship management and combat are a very different subject. Keeping your ship stocked with resources as well as maintaining morale is made to be so incredibly easy that these systems may as well have not been included. Outside of keeping your ship stocked with supplies, you can also buy upgrades and level up crew members. These can have benefits in combat, but the text-based ship-to-ship combat system is an uninteresting chore that most players will want to avoid as much as possible. In this way, ship combat is still similar to release, but there is now an option to skip the text-based combat and just jump straight to the boarding part, and this small change goes a long way and was very needed. The other quality of life improvements added to Pillars of Eternity 2 since release are also appreciated. These include level indicators for enemies, which might be unnecessary in some other RPGs but fit well with Deadfire's open-ended design, as well as things like recommended companions for quests now being listed in the journal, or a new recently used spells tab being added. These features might be small, but they show the willingness of Obsidian to continue to support their game and act on player feedback. And surprisingly, this also applies to the story. While not completely unheard of, it is unusual for a single-player game to receive additional story content post-release that is specifically designed to address players' criticisms with the existing story. In the case of Pillars of Eternity 2, this amounts to several new scenes that are designed to fit into the main story to answer the players' questions and clear up confusing plot points. This is a bit strange. It's like someone has taken a book and inserted new pages after the parts that readers don't like to try to counter any criticism. The thing is, the fact that Obsidian felt the need to do this kind of proves how serious the problems with the main story were, as it shows that to some degree, Obsidian must have agreed with those criticisms. However, to go back to the example of a book, there are such things as revised editions of books that may try to address a story's shortcomings, so there's no reason a game shouldn't be able to do something similar. Except, as a tool to fix narrative problems, simply inserting some new scenes seems like a very limited and somewhat clumsy approach. A story isn't always designed to allow space for future additions, and the way in which these scenes are designed feels overly deliberate. You can tell why they've been added, and what player criticism they are designed to solve, and this makes them feel unnatural. But to show you what I mean, we'll need to talk about spoilers. So if you want to avoid having anything spoiled, check the video description for a timestamp to skip forward. The new scenes focus around the gods, and include new dialogue for Aephus at the end of the game, as well as a new item called the Book of Wodaka that the player can use to phone up Wodaka for a friendly chat about how they're doing on their mission. The goal of these new scenes seems to be to fix a number of issues players had with the main story, such as the disconnect between the God's storyline and the faction storyline, understanding the consequences of Aephus' actions, and understanding Aephus' motivations. So let's look at each of these problems and their new solutions one by one. Connecting the gods and factions is done mostly through Wodaka providing commentary on them. She postulates that humanity needs the gods to function and points to the actions of the factions and the player's involvement with them as proof of her point. And Aephus briefly does something similar, but coming to the opposite conclusion at the end of the game. This is interesting, but there isn't any actual consequences to this, and it still doesn't change the fact that for the vast majority of the game, the storyline of the Deadfire feels largely separate to the storyline of the gods. So while this problem has been addressed, it hasn't really been solved. The other two problems involve the consequences and motivations of the god and sort of main antagonist of the game, Aephus. Aephus' goal is to destroy the wheel that was built by the Engwyffens in Ukaizo. The wheel is what the gods draw their power from, and it also allows the souls of the dead to be continuously reincarnated. But Aephus wishes to break it to liberate humanity from the influence of the gods. Throughout the entire game, the player's main objective is to stop Aephus from doing this because that's what the other gods want you to do. This is your main motivation in the story, making it pretty important. But most players probably dislike the gods and don't necessarily want to obey them. So many players were left wondering, why should they care? Why side with the gods? Why not help Aephus? After all, Aephus wants to help humanity, whereas the other gods are motivated by self-interest. The gods say that by destroying the wheel, humanity will be in danger, as the wheel facilitates reincarnation. However, there was a clear problem with this. The wheel is explained to have been man-made, just like the gods themselves, but humanity predates the wheel. So what happened before the wheel was made? We know humanity existed before the wheel, so surely humanity doesn't need the wheel to survive. This seemed like a plot hole, but the new Wodaka scenes try to answer this by saying that before the wheel was made, reincarnation still happened. It just wasn't very efficient and could lead to regular errors like people being hollow-born. The exact consequences of the wheel's destruction are still left unclear, but it is now easier to understand that the wheel is beneficial to humanity, and while its destruction leading to the gods being weakened might seem good, this benefit might not make up for the downsides, and so the player has at least some reason to want to actually stop Aephus. The issue with this new explanation is that it feels like the writers trying to retcon a plot hole that fans pointed out, particularly when you know this scene is new. This explanation does improve the story, but it feels like the writers talking directly to the player, as opposed to actually telling the game's story in a natural way. And it's also hard not to question why something as important as this was seemingly overlooked in the base game. Then there is the question of Aephus' motivations. Originally, it was hard to understand why Aephus wanted to break the wheel as a way to help humanity, when breaking the wheel is bad for humanity. The way the gods describe this makes it sound like breaking the wheel could even lead to humanity's extinction, and so the discrepancy between Aephus' actions and his intentions didn't seem to make much sense. Adair says as much to Eothas.
This isn't right. You can't put this burden on us. You can't make the gods' problems our responsibility to fix. How can you have faith that what you're doing is good? You know how many people are going to suffer because of this.
Who replies,
Adair, I wish I could explain it to you. It breaks my heart that I cannot.
Which kinda sums up the issue. But good news, in a new piece of dialogue a few seconds later, Eothas now tries to explain it all again. And his explanation really comes down to him just being a massive optimist who believes putting humanity in this situation will allow them to ultimately come together and grow on their own, while also proving to the gods that humanity doesn't need them. If Eothas' meddling by destroying the wheel sounds like a stupid and dangerous plan, then in a kind of meta sense that sort of proves Eothas' point that humanity really is better off without the meddling of the gods. And at least Eothas' motivations remain consistent in these new scenes. These scenes just serve to reiterate what was already implied, and so this dialogue seems less focused on fixing any plot hole and more about just adding a bit more clarity. As a result of these story changes, the consequences of the game's ending is easier to understand, and this does improve the story slightly. But there are many problems that still remain, like the writing of the gods, how lackluster the journey is to get to the end of the main story, and the way in which the entire story in Deadfire feels designed to set up the real story that is still to come. The new scenes also feel like new additions, rather than parts of the original story, which detracts from the storytelling. In the final scene with Eothas, you can even hear when the voice acting switches between the original dialogue and the new dialogue.
I will provide a haven for them after my work here is finished. Indulge me in a moment's curiosity.
And other things feel slightly contradictory. Wodeka's willingness to confide in and help the player doesn't feel like it fits her character, particularly if you've taken any actions to oppose her in some way, which most players will have. It might make sense if Wodeka was trying to manipulate you or use you as part of her own scheme, but she isn't, and that makes it feel like she's only there to answer the player's questions because the writers want to answer the player's questions and have no other idea on how to do so. Some of Wodeka's dialogue is also not voiced, which makes it stand out because it's the only non-voiced dialogue in the entire game, and the way in which some explanations feel designed specifically to address player criticisms also serves to draw attention to and highlight the very problems these additions are trying to address. So Obsidian deserves credit for trying to improve the story, but there's only so much that can be done by adding new scenes. The main story does feel less bad thanks to these additions, but less bad isn't the same as more good. And with the difficulty of combat now fixed, the weak main story remains as Deadfire's biggest problem. That doesn't mean the story is all bad though. The setting and factions are well done. The Deadfire archipelago has much more personality than the more generic setting of the first game, and the focus on colonialism feels refreshingly mature and balanced. Whereas the role of colonialism could have been overly simplified and depicted in a binary fashion of evil colonizers and helpless victims, instead it's handled with a degree of nuance and complexity, with the player ultimately left to come to their own conclusions of right and wrong. There are also several examples of well-designed quests, such as Fort Deadlight, Crookspur Island, or uncovering the secret of the Water Shapers Guild. These quests feature multiple solutions with some degree of moral complexity and further consequence, as well as including some well-crafted world building. The interaction between factions and quests is overall very well done, but unfortunately, these faction quest lines still feel like they escalate far too quickly, with the final quests coming across as extreme and very hard to justify. And finally, there are the free pieces of DLC. If you enjoyed Pillars of Eternity 2, then these DLC will be worth getting. Although if you didn't enjoy the base game, the DLC likely doesn't add enough to the experience to change that. Each DLC takes around 5 hours to complete, and the content is of a decent quality. Each one is themed after a specific god, with a new important problem for the player to be called in to solve. The first DLC, Beast of Winter, and the last DLC, The Forgotten Sanctum, each function as large, story-heavy endgame dungeons. Of the two, The Forgotten Sanctum is the more memorable, thanks to its stronger side characters and the less linear design of the dungeon, although both take the player to some interesting places. The second DLC, Seeker, Slayer, Survivor, is both the most unique of the three, and also the worst. This is partly because it has the weakest story, and partly because most of its content takes place in the same static arena, which makes its combat less engaging than the dungeons of the other two DLCs, despite the fact that the encounters are still well designed. However, when it comes to story, all three DLC have a similar problem that holds them back, which is that after Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, the writers seem to have written themselves into a bit of a corner, where they are, on the one hand, forced to include new big problems involving the gods, because otherwise the events of each DLC will feel unimportant and like a step down compared to the main game. But at the same time, the DLC writers can't actually provide any interesting consequences to these new stories involving the gods because they have to fit within the main game. There also doesn't seem to be many new exciting parts of the lore of Pillars world left to explore because so many important things to do with the gods or the Engwithans have already been revealed. So the DLC are left feeling a little like unimportant side stories despite how badly they try to seem important. The final DLC does end with a big, potentially significant choice for the player to make, but because this choice was made in a DLC, it seems unlikely that future games will offer any kind of follow-up. All three DLC also offer players opportunities to anger various gods, but as getting on a god's bad side in Pillars of Eternity 1 didn't mean much in Pillars of Eternity 2, it seems unlikely that angering a god here will mean much in the future. One final problem the DLCs have is that getting to max level in the base game is quite easy to do unless you ignore all side content, which means when you do get to the DLC, you will probably be at or very near to max level, despite having lots of content still to go, and no longer gaining XP or leveling up and gaining new skills is a bit boring. Still, overall, Deadfire's DLCs are quite good, and should meet or exceed most players' expectations. And so, 1 year later, Pillars of Eternity 2 has been improved a lot, even though some problems run too deep to be fixed in post-release patches. The main story is one such problem, but that hasn't stopped Obsidian from trying to improve it, and their effort is at least admirable. Other parts of the story are better, but fans that had high hopes for Deadfire as a follow-up to the first game might still be left disappointed. Gameplay has made the clearest improvement since release, but with the addition of a flawed but promising turn-based mode, Obsidian will have to think very carefully about what approach to take in the future. This is their second attempt at proving they can make a real-time with pause combat system that is better than the classics, and it still feels like they are making almost as many steps backwards as forwards. Other new features like the overworld map or the multi-class system have been resounding successes, but commercially Pillars of Eternity looks to have lost its way a bit and has clearly struggled to find its audience despite its positive reviews. What that means for the future remains to be seen, but perhaps it should be a sign that a complete focus on turn-based mode might be the best option. It seems worth pointing out that even game director Josh Sawyer, who was the main designer behind Pillars of Eternity's combat system and rule set, has publicly said that he prefers turn-based to real-time with pause, which really calls into question why Obsidian decided to make a real-time with pause game to begin with. But in the end, that's a question for Obsidian to worry about. Personally, I just hope there will still be a Pillars of Eternity 3, partly because despite Deadfire's shortcomings, I do still have an interest in the main story and wish to see it concluded, but also partly because I'm curious to see if Obsidian can maintain their record for most improved single-player game post-release. It may not be the best record to hold, as it will always be better to simply release a game that is already good, but in a world of dubious AAA and large publisher practices, there are far worse things a developer could be known for.